Great. Well, thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody for joining us here today. I'm very appreciative of you taking the time on a Friday morning. My name is Richard Nephew, and I'm a senior research scholar and program director here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And I'm joined by Eirik Wærness, senior vice president and chief economist of Equinor. This morning, he's going to present on Equinor's 2018 edition of Energy Perspectives. This report addresses some of the key questions facing global energy markets. How much will energy demand grow over the coming decades? Is the world going through an energy transition? And what is the future investment need in energy supply? And it offers three different scenarios for how these questions may be answered between now until 2050, covering all the main regions, sectors, and fuels. Equinor describes these scenarios as reform, renewal, and rivalry. And we have no one better than Eirik to lay out what Equinor's analysis has produced. As Senior Vice President and Chief Economist in Equinor, he is responsible for macroeconomics and energy and commodity market analyses, and he's the head of strategy in mid and downstream. He has broad experience from the government, from academia, and private sector companies, where he has served as both an advisor and in different leadership positions at such places as the Norwegian School of Economics, Norwegian Ministry of Finance, Total, and a number of other entities. Before turning over the floor to Eirik, let me first say quickly that this event, like all those at the Center, is being broadcast live, and both the video and podcast recording will be available on our website and iTunes in the coming days. And for those of you watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question at any time using the hashtag CGEPEvents and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy, or my personal handle @RichardMNephew, and I'll be checking that periodically as we proceed. After the presentation, I may take the privilege of asking a few questions of my own before opening the floor to questions from the audience. And with that, Eirik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. Friday morning, early, talking about energy to 2050. That's a long time ahead, but it's an important topic, and there's a lot of uncertainty about where the global energy markets are going. So it's a timely time to talk about it. I haven't checked the oil price this morning, but you've seen the volatility in the markets over the last months, and a lot of things are happening today as well. But we have to look forward. So my name is Eirik Wærness. I run the macroeconomics and market analysis department, if you like, in Equinor, and I'm responsible then for all kinds of market analysis associated with all the energy products that we're involved in, from day-to-day analysis supporting traders to the long-term energy perspectives, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And the Energy Perspectives publication is something that we in Equinor do as part of our social contract as an energy company. We have to make up our minds anyway about where energy markets are going to 2050 and beyond, because we do those types of long-term investments. And as part of that, we try to contribute to a fact-based discussion on global energy markets in the public arena. We've done this now for 8 years, and I hope to both contribute to that fact-based discussion, but also to challenge a bit on notions of how quickly we can change the global energy system, as an example, but also to be challenged back. So I hope we'll have some questions, and if I say something very wrong, then please address that, and we can have a discussion. When you think about where the global energy markets are going to 2050, it is crucially important to address things that are happening not only here or in Europe, but in particular in Asia, because that's where most of the people on Earth live. Half of the global population live less than 4,000 kilometers from Hong Kong. That's where the economic growth is the highest, and that's where there's a lot of energy poverty. So there's a lot of underlying energy demand coming in that area. It's also the area of the world which is characterized by a surplus resources in terms of coal and deficit resources, for instance, in terms of gas. So it's crucially important what happens there if you're concerned with climate change. And that's one of the reasons why we tend to have a picture of something in Asia on the front page of our reports, and this is an example. This is an example of all the goods transports, oil transports, gas transports going to and from Asia, if you like. And a lot of it passes through the Strait of Malacca. So that's the reason for the picture. When you look out the window and wonder where's the energy world going, you get different signals about that depending on which window you look out of, where you are, what sector you're focusing on, and I should say also what mood you have when you get up. On the one hand, you can become very optimistic in terms of the possibilities of decarbonization of parts of the energy system if you look at things like rapid penetration of electric vehicles now happening in parts of the world. 1 million new electric vehicles put on the roads last year, new cars. We passed 3 million at the end of that year, half of those cars in China. We passed 4 million this summer. So we think there is a potential that electric vehicles might be competitive with combustion engine vehicles within the next 5 to 10 years without subsidies. And the car producers globally will have to produce a lot of them in order to satisfy fuel efficiency standards. So there will be an offering of these cars for 5, 6 years down the road. Same thing when you look at the investments in new renewable sources of electricity generation, windmills and solar panels. Record capacity put out last year, 167 gigawatts. The costs keep coming down. They are competitive at the margin now in many places on Earth with alternative sources of electricity. Good news. On the other hand, bad news. CO2 emissions went up again in 2017 for the first time in 4 years. We had 3 years of flat emissions. Some people thought we had bent the curve, not so. Because of economic growth, rising coal demand, and an increase in oil demand as an example. 1.7 million barrels per day of higher oil demand in 2017 compared to the year before. And oil demand continues to grow this year. We've passed 100 million barrels per day of daily consumption or use. 1.7 million barrels per day of increase. The energy content of that is 3 times the potential electricity generation from those 167 gigawatts of windmills and solar panels. So it just shows you the scale of the challenge. Also, when we look out the window, things on the political arena are going in the wrong direction. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a euphoric moment for a lot of us when we thought about the possibilities of actually moving the world in the right direction, geopolitics and regional political conflicts have gone in the wrong direction. We're now talking about sanctions. We're talking about security of supply concerns, which is a legitimate concern. We do not trust each other. We do not transfer technology with everybody around us, which means that the political environment, the climate for sitting down and doing something together collectively to try and solve the climate challenge, which is one of the biggest collective problems we've ever faced, is not there. Hardly anything has happened on the measure side that would move us in the direction of the political targets that we agreed upon in 2015. So that's unfortunate. So then looking to 2050, we have to admit that we cannot make one forecast. The uncertainty is huge. So what we've done is we've made stories about the future, scenarios, histories that are really different and where we build on different assumptions and we make archetypes that are relatively extreme based on those types of assumptions. And we call them reform, rivalry, and renewal, as Richard said. The reform case, the central case, none of these are business as usual. The reform case assumes that all the national promises, the nationally determined contributions that was part of the Paris Agreement in 2015, in terms of energy intensity improvements, emission reductions, and so on, that all of those will be delivered upon by 2025 to 2030. And then subsequently, energy and climate policies will be tightened. Markets will continue to drive the development, and technology will drive the development. So it's a much more energy efficient world when you get to 2050 than today, as an example, with significant changes in fuel mix. But it doesn't deliver. The CO2 emissions hardly go down. So much more is needed than what the countries have actually promised to deliver, if you like. Then we've taken a scenario where we assume, what if the world, for some reason, would be able to reduce the CO2 emissions sufficiently to be consistent with the 2-degree target with a slightly higher than 50% probability. We call that world renewal, and then that's a backcast, so we know what we have to get to. We use the carbon budgets of IPCC, and then we calculate a way there, so we go backwards. That road, that path, is not a walk in the park. It's an enormously challenging development, and if we are serious about getting there, we have to do something very, very quickly in terms of policy measures, tightening energy and climate policies all over the place. Carbon pricing is one example. That's a fast transition there. There's economic growth there that is higher in the reform scenario. It's a scenario we all wish for. But wishing something for Christmas doesn't mean you always get it. So we have to be open for other opportunities as well. Then the rivalry scenario, that's a scenario where we build upon the assumption that the type of regional and geopolitical conflicts that we see today, that hamper cooperation, that hamper development, that hamper economic growth, might prevail, might come back and forth on regular intervals or irregular intervals, affecting our ability to solve collective challenges. So that's the rivalry scenario. There we have lower economic growth, less improvements in energy intensity, much more focus on security of supply, meaning that some of the countries where energy demand is growing fast will use too much coal because that's their resource. Indigenous coal in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, and China will be there, and it's more easy to revert to those in a world where you don't trust the Russians to deliver gas to you, as an example. So that's another world, which we don't know, we can't exclude. In all this uncertainty, there are some things we're reasonably or very certain about. One of them is that global demand for goods, services, and activities that require energy, whether when they are being produced or when they're being used, that global demand will go up, will increase. 2.5 billion more people on Earth by 2050, many billion new middle-class consumers. A lot of people today are energy poor. We have 1 billion people without access to electricity today, 400 million of which are in India. We have billions of people that only have access to extremely unsustainable biomass as sources of heating and cooking. They would like to have something else. So that underlying demand has to be satisfied. That doesn't mean that total primary energy demand will go up, because it depends on how energy efficient we can become and what type of energy we can turn to. The second thing we're certain about is that there is an energy transition happening. We see it in, as I mentioned, in electric vehicles. We see it in renewable electricity. The problem is that it's too slow, it's too small, it's too narrow, limited to too few countries and to too few sectors. It has to speed up if we are to deliver on climate targets. The third thing we're absolutely certain about is that enormous investments are needed in the energy sector to deliver on demand and to make sure that we change the energy system sufficiently to deliver on sustainable development. Not only do we need investments in renewables, in electricity, wind panels, windmills, solar panels, infrastructure grids, backup systems, storage, whatever. But we also need a lot of new investments in oil and gas to satisfy demand, to avoid supply from falling faster than demand. And I'll show you that towards the end. Many NGOs don't like it when I say that, and they almost do not believe me. I hope I'll be able to persuade you at the end. So then, what about how does energy demand develop, primary energy demand? Well, that depends. As I said, the underlying growth in demand for energy is starting out with, it's described by, if you like, the GDP development, the 3 lines at the top of the left chart there. So we think that in these 3 scenarios, global economic growth varies from an average of 2% in the rivalry case, the red line, to some 2.7% per year to 2050 in the renewal case. That means that global GDP will be twice to 2.5 times larger in 2050 than today, driven by more people, more labor, more highly educated labor, more women in the labor force in those countries where that is still possible, more capital behind each job, and technological progress, in particular as the emerging economies catch up with the rich economies. So economic growth will be there. Then does primary energy demand grow? Well, that depends on the energy intensity development, which is the inverse of energy efficiency. Look at the right chart, the dots there. Over the last 25 years, the white dots show an annual improvement in energy intensity of 0.9% per year on average. So that if economic growth were 3%, energy demand grew by 2.1 on average. Going forward, if we are to reach the 2-degree target, one way of getting there is in the renewal scenario, where we assume an energy intensity improvement annually of 2.8% per year. So we triple the rate of energy efficiency improvement, if you like, globally. A tremendous challenge. If that happens, and I just said that we have 2.7% economic growth, total primary energy demand will then fall by 0.1% per year, so that we by 2050 can deliver on all that energy demand with a total primary energy demand that is 6% lower. That's the green line at the bottom of the right chart. In the two other scenarios, we also have a faster improvement in energy intensity than historically, but not so much. So energy demand continues to grow, but of course significantly less than the GDP growth. So that's the starting point. And remember that this is the result, this energy demand here is the result after all kinds of behavioral changes caused by and driven by the energy intensity improvement. When something becomes more efficient, thereby cheaper, we have a tendency of using it more. We buy a larger car when the combustion engine becomes more efficient, right? Because we can afford it, part of that. We buy a larger refrigerator in Europe when we buy a new one. We like the American style ones, you know, the big ones with an ice cube machine on the front door, cold water coming out, et cetera, et cetera. So we use more energy as that. And at least in Scandinavia, now all men above the age of 40 have become beer brewers. So the old refrigerator is in the basement running as a beer cooler. So we have doubled, we double the energy use when something becomes more energy efficient when we replace the refrigerator. That's in this, right? That's part of this. So it's an enormous challenge. New renewables will grow. This is the energy transition shown by the energy mix changes, the fuel mix changes. And if you look at the left column, this is a complex chart. I have a couple of 3 messages here. Look at the left column there. That's the result of the revolution in renewables over the last decades is shown as the red sliver at the top. 2% of total primary energy demand is delivered by windmills and solar panels. Fortunately, it's growing fast. Fossil fuels are still 80% of total primary energy demand. It has been like that for at least 50 years. It's moving a little bit between gas, coal, and oil, but it's still more than 80%. Going forward, the energy transition will lead to a much faster change in fuel mix, we think, than we've seen historically in all the scenarios. And new renewables will grow much faster than anything else. But sufficiently so only in the renewal scenario, the middle of the 3 columns, where new renewables become 20% of total primary energy demand. That's what is needed. The other thing that is needed, we have to reduce coal demand by 75%. And imagine that half of global coal today is used in China. They have coal. They do not have gas. They have to transform their economy together with the rest of Asia away from coal, like many other countries in the West as well, if we are to make this. The third message is on the right chart. That's total final energy consumption. Their electricity is a carrier. When you listen to the debate some places about the need for change, it sounds as if all energy use in the world is electricity. That's not the case. It's just a matter of decarbonizing electricity and we're home free. That's what it sounds like sometimes. Well, it's only 20% of our energy use that is electricity. The rest is direct burning of something else. Going forward, we will become more electric, but we will not become electric. And in the renewal scenario, we double the rate, the normal rate of electrification, if you like, globally, so that we get to 35% by 2050. But still 65% will have to be something else, or will be something else, will be molecules used in energy. If you were to increase that share of electricity, which you can, which is possible, then the challenge in having enough renewable sources of electricity will become much bigger, because we need to invest even more in it. So those are the energy transition changes. CO2 emissions, as I've already said, the reform and rivalry do not deliver. CO2 emissions continue to rise in the rivalry type of world, moderately. CO2 emissions hardly come down in the reform scenario towards the end of it does come down, but towards the end of the period, but not much lower than today. The renewal scenario delivers on what is necessary to arrive at the 2-degree target with a slightly more than 50% probability. Not because it's easy, but because we've designed it that way, right? It's enormously challenging. And look to the right, what is needed. 80% reduction in the industrialized world. 67% reduction in CO2 emissions in China. The Chinese emissions today are 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. They have to go down by 67%. In an economy that grows 4 to 4.5% per year, which is still the manufacturing warehouse of the world, they have coal. And their emissions today are 4 times what they were in 1990. They have to go down to the levels they had in 2000 by 2050. Tremendous challenge. The most difficult one, possibly, look at India. India is a small country in GDP terms because it's poor. It's a very small country in the use of energy because it's extremely poor and energy poor. 400 million people without access to electricity. A lot of the energy mix in India is extremely unsustainable biomass used for cooking and heating inside their homes, leading to local pollution and premature deaths. They have to change that. It's one of the reasons why New Delhi is a much worse city than Beijing in terms of pollution. So they have to do what the Chinese did in the 70s, take away that sustainable biomass and replace it by something else also to provide electricity. But they can't do it via coal. If they do, we're in trouble. And India will be 8 times as large in 2050, 7 to 8% annual economic growth. They might be the world's 3rd largest economy, providing electricity to everybody, 300-400 million more people in 2050 than today. And they have to do that by reducing their CO2 emissions by 20%. We allow it to grow for a while and then come down. That's the biggest challenge in reaching the 2-degree target. And we should all be focusing on the possibilities of Asia to satisfy their energy demand in a sustainable manner with as low CO2 emissions as possible. That's what we should be discussing. How can we assist? They will figure it out themselves. They're smarter than us and they're much more people, but they might need some financing. That's why these financing mechanisms in the Paris Agreement are important. So on the sectoral changes then, what about electricity? We see electricity, as I said, as a growing source, carrier of energy. Electricity demand will grow in all scenarios. Look at the left there. We get a new source of electricity demand that becomes visible, and that's transport. So the green area is electricity demand from an electrifying transport sector. I'll come back to what that is. And then in the middle are all the sources of new generation and some sources of less generation. And the general message is that almost everything of new electricity globally will be and will have to be windmills and solar panels, a little bit of geothermal across all the scenarios. But then we have the extra challenge in the renewable scenario that we have to take out coal capacity and gas capacity, so we have to build even more. And that's what we do there. And then you get to the generation mix on the right. As I said, the result of the revolution we've seen in new renewable electricity is hardly visible in primary energy demand. You can see it here, but it's 5% of global electricity generation so far. That will, in the renewable scenario, go to, and it has to go to, we think, 50%. So half of global electricity will be coming from uncontrollable resources in a system where we then need a lot of infrastructure, we need a lot of backups, we need a lot of demand management systems, and we have to make sure that there's a price on electricity that allows professional investors to make money. And that's not a given either when you get so much new renewables. Today, the new renewable investments are piggybacking on either subsidies, fixed prices, guaranteed prices for a period, or on the bet that there will always be a gas-fired or coal-fired power plant out there running, setting a price. If you risk that your neighbor who runs another solar panel facility ensures that the electricity price is 0 and you produce as well, then you don't get the money. It's a very bad investment signal. That has to be fixed, or we have to avoid that. And that's a regulatory issue, which is difficult. And we think it can take place. Look at how much coal we take out in the electricity sector. Other 2-degree consistent scenarios, like the SDS scenario, IEA, or the Sky scenario, Shell, they have more coal in the electricity mix than we do in our renewable scenario. The consequence of that then is that they need much more carbon capture and storage assumptions in 2050 than we need in our case. And of course, that's a choice of priorities and possibilities. If you don't think it's possible to get coal sufficiently down or gas sufficiently down in the electricity sector, you need more CCS to deliver on that. We have 1.5 billion tons of CCS in our scenario by 2050. 1.5 billion tons. Not a lot of us have a very intimate relationship with 1 billion ton of CO2. Is that a lot? Yes, it is. In order to get to 1.5 billion tons, we have to build a 1 million ton facility every 8th day from now to 2050. And 1.5 billion tons is twice, as an example, twice the global mass of wheat that we produce and eat every year, 750 million tons. So just imagine the industrial activity around gathering 1.5 billion tons of CO2, transporting it and storing it. It's enormous. And then Shell, Sky scenario, they don't have 1.5 billion tons, they have 4 by 2050. On road transport, So we've talked about electricity, now we talk about transport. And mainly road transport is where we see significant changes in terms of the fuel mix. And we see rapid, we're very aggressive compared to many others here on the possibilities of electrifying light-duty vehicles. That's the left part in this. Everything that is less than 3.5 tons and have wheel and run on the road. We think, and we see that as one of the best options of getting to the, moving towards a 2-degree target, is that by 2030, 65% of all new light-duty vehicles will have to be electric. 65. Today is 1 out of 80. 6 out of 10, 6.5 out of 10 by 2030, 12 years from now. That means that the fleet is basically fully electrified by 2040, and in 2050, as you see here, it's for all practical purposes electrified. But in the reform scenario also, we're very aggressive on both electric vehicles and hybrids. That takes away a lot of oil demand, which today is 25 million barrels. In that segment, we have 25 million barrels of oil basically disappearing to 2050. I don't show the buses, but it's a bit of the same there. We have a lot of electric buses. Then we have the truck fleets, which are in the middle there, which will be much more efficient in the renewable scenario, and we will have much more efficient logistics so that we don't need as many trucks. Look at that compared to the other scenarios, in spite of all this extra good demand. We will have quite a bit of electricity there, we think, in short distance. We'll have some LNG in long distance trucking, but we'll still have quite a bit of oil running on much more efficient combustion engines than we have today. That's road transport. That's where we see big changes. Then it's on the fuel side, we do not see big changes in the rest of transport, which is shipping and aviation and railroad. But railroad energy use is so small that you don't see it here, but that will be completely electrified. Anything that goes on rails, whether it's public transportation or not. We will have much more efficient shipping and enormously more efficient aviation, so that we don't use more oil. We use less oil in aviation and shipping in 2050, in spite of possibly a tripling of air passenger miles. There's very few things that grow by double-digit growth rates for many, many years. On the demand side, I know of 2. One is the number of Chinese traveling internationally every year. It's gone up by 17% on average since 2000. If that were to continue, we would have 8 billion movements of Chinese in and out of the country by 2040, and then you can add on that 10 years and just imagine. That's probably not going to happen. That's a lot of flying. It's a lot of underlying flying demand. The other one that I can think of is the number of flights landing, passengers landing in Reykjavik in Iceland. Also grows by double digit now for more than 10 years. And it's not only Chinese, it's Americans and Germans. And also indicates the underlying demand for that type of travel. And that will happen, we think, but it will have to happen with much more efficient combustion engines. It will not happen by electricity by 2050, at least not long distance travel. So we have a revolution hidden in that chart to the right as well in the renewable scenario, just to make that clear, even though you don't see the electricity there to a large extent. This is generally where many others, or this is where a lot of the other people that are concerned about climate change stop. They've covered electricity, they've covered transport, and we're home free. No. Energy use is much more than transport and electricity. And in those sectors, the difficulties of changing the mix, making it even more efficient, is probably larger. To the left, we have what we call, or what IEA calls industrial demand, what I like to call manufacturing demand. It's the manufacturing processes that use energy to produce all the goods and services that we have around us. That will be more electric, much more electricity. In the renewable case, much more efficient. But it will still use fossil fuels to some extent, especially in those processes where it's difficult to replace molecules with electrons. For instance, in very high heat types of manufacturing process, we think. If you were to electrify more of that, it would challenge even more the necessary investments in electricity systems as well. So there's a balance there. There will be some coal use left here, and this is where we have most of the carbon capture and storage, is on the remaining cement factories and the steel factories to take the carbon out. Then in the middle is housing and buildings. And remember, we're going to have 2.5 billion more people. That might mean 700 million to 1 billion new houses. that have to be built, and which will require heating and increasingly cooling. Not necessarily because it gets warmer, it does, but a lot of these houses are built in areas that are relatively hot during the summer, and they will be providing housing for a lot of middle-class consumers who tend to get the American habit of having air conditioning. When I came here as a student in 1981, this was the only country in the world that had air conditioning, and I almost froze to death every time I went into a room. And I got a cold right away because it was 10 centigrades warmer on the outside than on the inside. But now we see that even in Norway, 60 degrees north now. I used my electrical heat pump as an air conditioner in June because it was so hot, right? That's coming all over the place. 700 million new homes, a lot of new office buildings in the middle there, more electricity, much more efficient use, but still a lot of energy that we need to provide. That's part of that. And then to the right, that's the non-energy demand, which is feedstock. That's the use of fossil fuels, the fantastically flexible hydrocarbon molecules to produce all our stuff, goods. And where the carbon is contained in the molecule, and the energy use associated with making it on the left side, so if we make that renewable, then we keep the carbon. This is where we get plastic pollution. But this is also everything else. Plastic and packaging is a relatively small part of that. That demand tends to grow with economic development, with GDP. When we get more middle-class consumers wanting to buy cars, wanting to have meeting rooms covered by chairs and tables and wall-to-wall carpets that are made out of oil and gas, etc., etc. And have our middle-class lifestyles are completely dependent on hydrocarbons. I often ask, has anybody here tried a day without polymers, oil and gas? Sometimes people say yes, and then I ask them the question back. That means you didn't brush your teeth this morning, because that's when you start. The toothbrush and the toothpaste contains polymers. And then you hardly have any clothes to put on. You go into a kitchen that doesn't have any appliances. You go into your garage, but there is no car. You walk without shoes on a gravel road to an office building that doesn't exist. That's a day without polymers. You turn back and go home, right? So, and there will be alternative materials, and we will do more recycling, et cetera, but that underlying demand is something we think will grow. We might be on the high side here. The IEA we're just out now with the petrochemicals report. They have a slightly lower growth rate. We'll look at that again next year. But it is there. And then that means, for an oil and gas company that is turning into an energy company, the change in oil and gas demand are important. This is another complex chart, but there are three messages here. What happens to oil demand? Look on the left side. If you're wondering about that, you find the answer in the transport sector. In the renewal scenario, we have such an enormous change in the transport sector, both more efficient combustion engines, but in particular electrification of light-duty vehicles, that there's a significant negative demand component for oil from road transport. It's the large blue part of the column. And look at the narrow blue, light blue, which is the aviation shipping demand. It goes down in that scenario. In the other scenarios, the changes in the transport sector are not sufficient to cater for some growing demand components, so the demand continues to grow, if you like. Second message, if you're wondering about gas demand, whether that goes up or down, in total, you find the answer in the power sector. So in the renewal scenario, energy efficiency, but in particular decarbonization through new renewables, leads to a significant negative demand component from the power sector to gas. That's the maroon color there. That leads to a slight negative overall gas demand for gas. In the two other scenarios, there's positive growth, also from the electricity sector because of electrification growing so much and not sufficient decarbonization. The third message is that this non-energy demand, the beige there, is a positive growth component for oil and gas across all scenarios. So that leads to some growth in oil demand and gas demand. And then, of course, the net is the impact of all these factors. So then, what is the need for new oil investments? This is the third belief that I started out with. And I start out with oil. First of all, this is a really bad forecast. If you look at the white demand range to the left there. So what is oil demand going to be? My boss, the CEO of Equinor, he's concerned with oil demand in 2050. And then I have to tell him, well, it depends. 60 million barrels if you believe in the renewal scenario, by 2050, or 120 if you believe in the Roberts scenario. It's a really bad forecast for being a chief economist, right? When he was reminded of the story of Harry S. Truman. When he became president, he asked for a one-armed chief economic advisor because he was so tired of listening to an economist saying on the one hand and on the other. But take the demand forecast here in the renewable scenario. It's a 40% reduction, down from 100 today to 60. If we stopped all activities in global oil supply, in the global oil industry, except painting existing installations and making sure they didn't fall apart. We stopped investing in increased oil recovery. We stopped putting water and gas down in the reservoir to keep pressure high. We stopped putting a platform on top of an existing resource so that we can make it into a reserve that could supply new oil. We stopped exploring. Existing supply will fall by 3 to 6% per year globally. We'll lose the equivalent of the total US shale oil production every year to natural decline. That means that by 2050, the Permian, the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, et cetera, potentially could only supply 10 to 30 million barrels per day, depending. So if you take the lower part of that, and then you see all the new oil, all the things we have to invest in to deliver on the 2-degree demand trajectory, that area is the light blue and the gray, could be 480 billion barrels. None of us have a feeling for that, what that is. 480 billion barrels of new oil from something that doesn't produce today to satisfy the demand in a 2-degree world. It is 30% more than OPEC in total has delivered over the last 35 years, the white column to the right. That's what OPEC in total has delivered over the last 35 years. And we need more, 30% more, potentially, to satisfy demand in a 2-degree world. That's the new investments. And to do that in a situation where the markets realize that demand has peaked yesterday, or 2022, is a difficult investment proposition as well. You could question whether we can do that. You think oil is difficult? This is gas. Here we have a better, at least a less varying forecast. Demand doesn't fall as much in the 2-degree scenario. Gas has a bigger role to play in a low-carbon transition. But the gap then between existing sources of supply and sources of supply where we actually have to do something is bigger. It's probably easier to pinpoint where that gas is, location-wise. Shale gas in the United States, some shale gas in Argentina, East Africa, Russia, Australia, Qatar, Middle East, Iran. But for oil companies, energy companies, gas is much more difficult to make profitable because it's more capital intensive. We need more pipelines and LNG facilities, et cetera, and the gas price is lower. So it's more difficult to make profitable, to fill that gap. 71 trillion cubic meters is what we might need. And if you believe in the other scenarios, it's even higher. 71 trillion cubic meters is 60% more than the accumulated supplies from the largest gas producers in the world, Russia, United States, Iran, Qatar, and the rest of the Middle East. All those 3 columns to the right there. We need 60% more. And then comes the new renewables. Here we don't have the whole picture. We don't model things like infrastructure investments and grids and so on. But to the left, we just show our assumptions in the annual capacity additions for windmills and solar panels as an example. And both in the reform and the renewal scenario, we believe that that capacity will grow more and more every year. Not with the same exponential growth rates, that's impossible, but it will grow. Gross capacity additions. But as this industry also becomes then older and bigger, the challenge in terms of replacing windmills and solar panels that become obsolete will be bigger. And that's the white part. So when you're in the renewal scenario, in 2050, we have to invest twice as much as we did last year just to replace something that is taken out of production because it's becoming too old or obsolete. 20-year, 25-year lifetimes. We might be wrong on that a little bit on the solar panels, but on the windmills, we think that's what the economic lifetimes are. That's a chunk. Also, when you look at how much windmills and solar panels we have in 2050 in the renewal scenario, and you see that those have been produced by the global steel and cement industry over the last 20 years, it could require 10 to 20% of the global steel production capacity to do that alone. And then you have the infrastructure needs, the grid lines. There's a study in Norway now about decarbonizing the European electricity market in an efficient way to 2050 could require a 7-doubling of the overall size of the grid to make it efficient. Trunk lines through the Pyrenees, through the Alps to transport solar electricity from Spain to Northern Europe, etc., etc. So that's part of this as well. And then to the right, we just show a little bit. We don't dare to go beyond 2030, but if we are to realize the rapid growth in electric vehicles, just for the cars, the light-duty vehicles, we need 35 times more batteries delivered to the cars in 2030, 12 years from now than today. We think the resources are there, but it requires a lot of investment in increased supply capacity. 35 doubling the mining, if you like, of lithium and cobalt. 35 doubling of the railroad transport from the mines to the coastline, if you're in Bolivia, as an example, to the battery factories. And then the battery factories have to be 35 times larger in order to satisfy demand. And today we're waiting months for batteries for electric vehicles in Norway. And Norway is a tiny little country, tiny market. So this is about an industry that has to basically explode its supply capacity over the next 12 years. And then at the end, just to show you a little bit on where we are compared to others, the good thing about having 3 significantly different scenarios is that we span out a lot of what other people think. And if you look at this is a very complex chart, but the dotted lines here are ours. Then we have the 3 IEA scenarios. We have Exxon's outlook, BP's outlook, and also the outlook from the Norwegian supply company DNV, which they've done a fantastic job as well in doing these scenarios. One message is that, at least here, is if you look at the right chart there, we're not very optimistic on behalf of gas in our 2-degree scenario. So we cannot be accused of that, if you like. So you can make 2-degree scenarios that contain more gas than ours, and the IEA SDS scenario is an example on that. Otherwise, we cover this relatively well. We might be on the high side on the oil demand in the rivalry case, and we'll look at that again for next year. And then on electricity generation and the share of that, which is solar and wind, generally in the middle of the pack, both on generation and on the share. If you look to the right, you see 2 extreme assumptions on electricity. One is the Shell Sky scenario, which has much, much more electricity than, for instance, we do. And they have a constant, or the same share of, basically the same share of solar and wind as we do. And as a consequence, of course, they have much more coal in that mix, and therefore also much more carbon capture and storage. And the DNV, they have more electricity, but they have a very, very optimistic assumption on how much of that could be delivered from solar and winds, 70%. So there are different scenarios out there, but it just shows you the uncertainty. So in order to get to the 2-degree target, or even below, we need everything that I've talked about. We need carbon capture and storage, much more energy efficiency. We need more nuclear. I didn't mention that, but we need that, do that as well. We need electrification. We need decarbonization. There's no silver bullet. And we need policy changes now. And we have to stop talking about the finer details of moving to a 1.5-degree world or a 2-degree world. We waste so much time. We better start. We know we're going to go in that direction. And then if we can get far enough, it's much better if it becomes 2 degrees than 3. And 1.5 might be better than 2, but at least let's start moving in the right direction, because this is an enormous challenge that we have to face up to. And Equinor is a company that wants to be part of this, and that means we're going to invest in oil, because we need it. We're going to invest in gas, and we're going to grow significantly in new renewables if we can make it profitable. If we can make it profitable. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting presentation, especially the number of scenarios that you were having to evaluate across things that seem both big and small. For instance, the issue of solar panels actually messing up markets such that you can't accurately price electricity. It's a fascinating insight that I don't think many folks would normally take. Again, for those who are watching online and listening to the podcast, my name is Richard Nephew, and I am here with Eirik Wærness, the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of Equinor. And I'm going to take the privilege of a couple of questions before turning things over to the audience. The first is a very specific one. It struck me as I was listening to your description of aviation fuel, but reflecting on your discussion of solar panels and electric vehicles, that there's a sharp distinction between how individuals will behave when they have the opportunity to get electric vehicles or solar panels or so forth, and how companies might choose to behave. For instance, you note the fact that solar panels are going to, potentially, create pricing issues, as I was just saying, and that individuals might choose to take those on. You need regulatory mechanisms to help set the price. But you also suggest, with regard to aviation sector, that because of efficiencies, you're going to see at least some degree of realization of reduced oil use, at least per plane. And I would question that a little bit and ask you to flesh this out a little bit further. It strikes me that if you were to start to see oil demand go down, as in some of your scenarios you have, and if you were to see that investors in particular would make decisions about where they thought oil was going to go and the price of oil was going to go, that airline companies and airplane manufacturers may not be as incentivized to pursue the efficiencies as they would normally. And I think about this in reflection of how the car industry in the United States responds to lower oil prices. We get a lot more SUVs being bought by Americans and a lot more being advertised by American car companies when prices are low. So I would just be curious as to how solid you think the efficiency process is going to be, in particular for aviation, but maybe other industries, if in fact prices do start to reflect that reduced demand and maybe even a little bit more supply.
All right, so that's a good question, but I think it's the total package of measures that need to be in place in terms of moving the world in the right direction in the renewal scenario that will determine the combined response from consumers, car producers, airline or airplane producers, and airplane customers. And in a renewal case, you're right. I mean, we will have much lower producer prices of oil and gas in that scenario than we do in the other two scenarios. They do not necessarily much lower than today. That depends on the marginal cost of supply, but much lower than in the other two scenarios. But in order to ensure that the correct behavioral change on car producers, airline producers, and car consumers and passengers, we will need, for instance, a lot of fuel efficiency standards that will be required. They will have to produce these things, so they will be banned, if you like, if they don't. And we as consumers will have to be facing somewhere between $100 and $150 per ton carbon price put into the price of jet fuel and gasoline. So you'll see that change of behavior as well. And the consumer price of oil, if you like, or the associated products coming out of oil in the renewal scenario will probably have to be much higher, or at least as high as in the rivalry case, if you like. And the difference will be the carbon tax or the carbon price and the implicit carbon price that you get from extremely tough fuel efficiency standards. So it has to be both, otherwise it won't work.
Well, thanks for that, because that actually leads to my next big question. It struck me as I was listening to you that you both are forecasting potential scenarios as well as to some extent advocating on behalf of one scenario, the renewal scenario. And this leads me to ask, what are the top 2 or 3 policy initiatives that you think have to be undertaken now in order to make the renewal scenario viable? You just mentioned fuel efficiency standards as well as carbon price. Are there any other specific policies that you think are absolutely instrumental to make the renewal scenario take off?
I think those two are, a combination of those two are the critical ones. In some countries, the price on carbon is still negative, so the fossil fuel subsidies have to go away. That is an extremely difficult proposition in some countries where that is needed for poor people being allowed to have a car. And just imagine Venezuela. But that is one part of it. We have to start pricing carbon properly in an efficient manner. That can, on transportation, that's generally a tax. But on larger emission sources, you can do that through a trading scheme with very tough quota restrictions, like we're now seeing, fortunately, developing in Europe. if that works, if the Chinese put in place a quota system that works, they will be immediately possibly be facing the question, what do we do with carbon leakage? If some of the manufacturing production then leaves China and go to the neighboring country where if they don't have a tax. So then you also get the border adjustment issue relatively quickly. And that's also something that has to be handled. That you, I mean, the paradox, or if you like, the tragedy of the European climate policy is that we've had some reduction in carbon emissions in Europe since 1990. Particularly in the UK, has delivered very good results. But mainly that has been on the production side. And part of it, of course, driven by a deindustrialization. And we've moved the manufacturing to China. And then we import much more carbon than we did before. And we don't adjust at the border. So European consumers consume more carbon, if you like, than we did in 1990, even though the production within. So you get those, so the carbon adjustment taxes, quota systems, carbon pricing, and then fuel efficiency standards across the board. That's what, and it has to take place rapidly, because that will also drive technology development. And we might also have governments assist in technology development, but then more on the general side, research and development, and not picking technologies, because that's difficult. But some on the general side. But I think that's, and we also have to start talking seriously about how to alleviate the change or make the change easier in countries that are not as rich as we are here, and that are facing serious balance of payments issues if they're to replace their own coal with imports of gas, for instance, as part of the transition. How do we alleviate that? And you'd also get, how do you make the large resource holding countries that are poor still, many of them, tag along and think that this is a good idea? How do we do it? Because a global carbon price, more or less global carbon price, set by many different countries. We don't believe in one carbon price, but that's a transfer of income from the resource-holding large hydrocarbon countries of the world to the consuming countries. And how do we make that look like a good idea for a country like Saudi Arabia or Qatar?
And this takes me to my last question, which is, I'm reflecting on the fact that to some extent some of these scenarios are almost conditioned, not necessarily on inevitability, as you just outlined. There are a number of policy steps that need to be taken, but there are some things that can proceed absent a lot of government intervention, or potentially, the time where they needed as much government intervention, has gone away. At least that's the conclusion that has been taken by some U.S. policymakers when it comes to things like electric vehicles and solar and so forth. What would your evaluation be of the state of those markets? In other words, are they mature enough that we're going to get those electric vehicles that you were speaking of no matter what? Or are policy changes being taken by the United States now to remove some of those incentives going to have a damaging effect, a substantial damaging effect specifically? Or do you think that the choices being made by emerging countries, like your Indias, like your Chinas and so forth, are going to be more important relative to kind of the total objectives that we're pursuing here?
At the macro scale, the choices made in Asia will be much more important, I think, because that's where you, first of all, have a lot of people, and that's where the change in economic development and thereby also energy use is the largest. But a lot of the good thing about some of the technology development we've seen now is that it has created a moment of its own. The batteries will become more efficient going forward. Electric vehicles, with the fuel efficiency standards, in particular in Europe, but also here, the large car producers now must deliver a suite of models which contains also no emission, or at least in the use, no emission cars. Otherwise, they won't satisfy the fuel efficiency standards. But what we need is, at least on the consumer side, to assist in a sufficiently rapid pickup of those types of technologies. As an example, the price on carbon would help, right? It would make it more expensive to keep driving your old diesel vehicle or a gasoline vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. So we still need both of those. And general research and development subsidies, where I think, as I mentioned, and you mentioned it in your intro to the Q&A, where I think we need to start thinking seriously more seriously about how do we make sure that we have a market that works when so much of the electricity generation is based on falling average cost and zero marginal cost type of technologies, and what sets the future wholesale price of electricity. Last year in Germany, 13% of the hours, more than 1,100 hours, had wholesale prices of electricity that were below the short-run marginal cost of a gas-fired, coal-fired nuclear plant. So they ran with a deficit. And you had more than 100 hours where the price was negative. So you had to pay to get rid of the electricity to put it on the net. So in a sort of the rhetorical question is that if not even Germany can get this right, or at least not yet, what country can? And that's a problem. That's an issue that has to be handled, right? Yeah. And it can be handled, that's about policy. Yeah.
No, like I said, I thought, to me, of all the insights that you provided here today, that was one of the more complex and creates a real conundrum of how you balance encouraging individual behavior and encouraging individual action, but what can happen on a societal basis. It really is. It's a fascinating conundrum. We're now going to open up the discussion to questions from the audience. For those who are here in person, I think microphones that are at your chairs all function. So you should be able to push the button once you're recognized and be able to ask your question. For those who are watching online, I am still monitoring Twitter, and you can please again use the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy, or my own Twitter handle at Richard M. Nephew to ask a question. Sir. No deal?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk, Mr. Wærness.
Yeah.
I got it.
You got it.
Thank you. Technology challenged. Thank you again very, very much, and especially for including some of the comments that you did towards the end. I was waiting to hear the word nuclear, and I heard it at the end, which I was very happy. I think you're right. Time for talking about it is over, and I'd like to throw a number at you and see how you react with the question that I have. Is a $50 per ton CO2 equivalent carbon price a reasonable starting point, keeping in mind that some countries even today have a lot higher than that, like 100 or even 150, but most countries, like 85% of the countries, have numbers that are closer to $10 or less, even under $1, some, quite a few countries. In order to kickstart the activity towards more proactive transition, especially in view of the recent comment by ExxonMobil that was agreed to by other major oil companies and non-oil companies about perhaps coming up with a legislation in the United States, at least sometime in 2020 or so, that would allow a carbon dividend so that the industry pays for a carbon tax, although no number was mentioned in the various articles that I've seen, but something substantial like that that might translate back into a consumer carbon dividend of what is thrown around is $2,000 per family, but I'm not sure it was per year or if it was a one-time type of thing and then go over. Is that enough? In other words, we're hearing about carrots, we need sticks to be in place, including, and that's the second part of the question, not only a carbon tax, but also things that Europe has taken into account, such as bans. And you use that word, and obviously Norway and other countries are doing that in terms of bans at a certain time in the future for ICE or internal combustion engines by comparison to electric vehicles. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would make, that would make an enormous first step. And it would be enough to start changing behavior at the margin. And what that is the key here, right? It is the consumer behavior that has to change. And then that will also impact incentives to develop new technologies on the supply side, combustion engine efficiencies and things like that. So if we had a $50 price on carbon, it could be a tax or something else now, in the large consumer countries of the world, including China and the United States, we would talk very differently about the possibilities of getting to a 2-degree target because we would have moved already. And the good thing about it also, when this is on a personal side, I mean, Equinor, we advocate for a carbon price. We use, by the way, a slightly above $50 real carbon price in all our investments, irrespective of where they are. So they have, I mean, our investments will have to satisfy a $50 per ton carbon price, even if it's in Brazil, where there is no such tax today. So we have that within our systems, and many of the other oil companies do as well. The good thing about a tax is that it's so extremely easy to introduce. A quota system is much more difficult to handle and set up, and you have an administration around it. In some respects, it's better, quota system, because then you know what the emissions will be. We do not know the impact of a tax, but I guess maybe with the exception of the United States, introducing a tax is politically, at least in terms of process, much easier. And it's also, in a sense, more efficient because the required bureaucracy around it is much less. So, but we will see a combination of these types of things. And the point is that, as you said, I mean, it's the urgency here that is important, and we have to respond to that very, very quickly. And then, of course, one of the challenges now that we're increasingly seeing protests or unhappiness about the potential distributional consequences of climate policies that work. And not only, there's a lawsuit in California on some of the impacts of their climate policies, which are harming the poor much more than others. We see it in Scandinavia now, in Norway now, we have very high protests now against the new toll road schemes around some of the big cities. And those types of distributional consequences, of course, has to be handled. But it is a dilemma that if polluter pay principle is the one that will make us change behavior, so we have to pay for this at the margin. And then how do you compensate, if you are to compensate, and avoid the protests? Having an income distribution back, compensating that way could work, but because the price at the margin will be right. But of course, if some of these goods are income elastic, we use more of them, the more income we have, I mean, part of the impact will disappear. So this is it's a really tough dilemma. But I think putting a price on something that we don't want, which is carbon, is the most efficient and the most urgent thing to do, to at least start bending the curve.
Great. Gentleman in the back.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating discussion. A couple of very quick questions. Firstly, theoretically speaking, in terms of the modelling that you've done, what do you anticipate would be the consequence for the speed of the electrification of the vehicle fleet over the world if the oil-producing countries of the world were able to coordinate to put a floor under the price of crude, say from 2020 the price of a barrel of crude will not fall below $100 a barrel? What do you think, in terms of the modelling, the impact that would have on how electrification happened? And then secondly, why is it that Norway continues to decline to participate in the Vienna Group OPEC Plus supply management efforts of the last couple of years? Thanks.
Well, on the first question, I guess the most important drivers behind the potential for rapid uptake of electric vehicles is the availability of the technology, the availability of cars, the offering, if you like. The price of the car at the investment decision has to be competitive, and especially price performance. To increase, or at least to guarantee that the oil price never goes below a certain threshold, at the margin would help. But the user cost of the car is not that important when you do the purchasing decision. And so we think it's more the availability of the cars, the models that they have to work, and of course the trust that you can charge them when you want, which is not a given. You know, that you can park and that you don't have to park them for 16 hours to fill the batteries and then drive 8 hours. There's something about driving habits in different countries that also makes it difficult. Germany is one example. I mean, when you have a freeway system there with free speed, and they're used to driving 800 kilometers for 4 hours to go on vacation or to the Italian coastline during a weekend or whatever. And an electric vehicle cannot drive 800 kilometers in 4 hours. So those types, the habits as well or something. So there are many of those types. Charging points, etc., probably more important than guaranteeing a price. But of course, putting a carbon price on top of the gasoline price ensures that you have a floor, at least some floor. You get a better buffer. Gasoline cars become more, or diesel cars become more expensive to use, and you would move in that direction. A big paradox now on the US statistics is that those people that own an electric vehicle in the United States, they're generally much richer than the average car owner. The electric vehicle is driven much less, even though the fuel cost, once you bought it, indicate that you should drive it as much as possible. But of course, if it's the rich people that buy it, they have enough money, but they don't have enough time. So if the charging issue is an issue, you drive a gasoline car instead. They also, by the way, have a higher number of cars in total. I mean, I saw a statistic that the average one-person household in the United States that owns an electric vehicle, on average, has 2.7 cars. So this is sort of the thing you do when you go shopping in San Francisco on a Saturday, I guess. I don't know. And we see the same in Norway, too. I mean, the electric vehicle, we now have more than 50% electric vehicles in the new car sales. 60% if you include plug-in hybrid in September this year. But the car is generally an extra car, or it's a car that you have something else. Sometimes you even replace bus transport with electric vehicles. We can drive in a bus lane, which is bad for the possibilities of transitioning, and we still don't see it in the diesel and gasoline demand. So there's extra driving, if you like, on top. So, well, you have to ask the Norwegian government why we're not part of those types of things, but or the Vienna, the OPEC Plus agreement. The Norwegian oil production is small. It's falling, crude oil production as well, and we've had a long policy of participating in the market here as a small producer and adding to a group, starting to negotiations is would probably make it more difficult. Whether we are in or out in that group probably wouldn't matter.
Great. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, you mentioned all of the manifold challenges in trying to bring in the technology and the bottlenecks.
Can you put the microphone?
Turn the microphone.
Just right there. There you go.
Yeah, you were mentioning the manifold challenges in hitting the 2-degree target from the bottlenecks in steel production and a lot of things people don't think about. When you look at the base case, what kind of GDP diminishment would also get you to the target in 2050, just to give it a sense of scale? Do you have to take, global or non-OECD GDP down 100 basis points to achieve the same outcome, or is it not even possible?
Well, we haven't done that calculation, but of course, lower economic growth makes it easier, if you like. Because you get an automatic reduction in underlying energy demand growth. On the other hand, reducing lower GDP growth is not something that is easy to sort of decide upon. And it's definitely not sustainable. We would meet different types of sustainability issues well before that if we were to say that the global economic growth would sort of be forced below what is driven normally by population growth. We basically know the population growth to 2050. That's an underlying driver for economic growth and energy demand growth. And then if we would, force people not to deliver on their technology development, that would also deliver economic growth. So that's a more of a philosophical and political discussion. If we continue in the direction of much tougher protectionist policies, tariff barriers, cater for our own jobs at home instead of opening up for international trade and taking the benefit of comparative advantage, economic growth will be lower than if we don't have that, and that's what we modeled in the rivalry scenario, right? So there you get in the rivalry scenario, believe it or not, you get some help by the lower economic growth compared to, but then it depends, of course, of how much slower technology development goes in that type of scenario. Lower economic growth also means much less money to change the technology, much less tax revenues to stimulate research, etc., etc. So that's also part of that. So
Gentleman in the back.
Thanks again for a really interesting presentation. I'm curious what role you see for carbon dioxide removal playing in the future of energy. With IPCC's 1.5 report, they showed that every pathway to 1.5 degrees involves some level of carbon dioxide removal, whether it's afforestation or reforestation or BECCS or direct air capture. I'm curious how you think about that and what role you see carbon dioxide removal playing in the future.
Yeah, I think we need a lot of it, irrespective. We have to solve, at the margin at least, we have to solve both carbon capture technologies and make that possible, driven also by a high carbon price in some of the manufacturing processes we have. And if we're not able to decarbonize the electricity sector faster, we'll also have to do it there. The future of natural gas, the very long-term future of natural gas, might also depend on being able to take out the carbon of the methane molecule and then use hydrogen as an energy carrier. That's an easier technology to do that, but it requires a lot of storage. And in addition, what is good about the type of discussion that you get out of IPCC is that we also focus on the non-energy related both challenges and opportunities. Generally, we do not discuss this enough, and it's generally not part of the political discussion around carbon policies. It's things like carbon sinks. We should probably do more in terms of reforestation and stopping deforestation, both not only in the rainforest, but we should also look at we don't know the delta on the carbon binding in the forest in the northern hemisphere, whether it's in Russia or Canada or Scandinavia. How much can we do there to increase the capacity of the forest to bind carbon? And that's part of the discussion. And then, of course, at some point you get to the geoengineering possibilities. We're not experts on that at all, but it will play a role. And at some point, it might become too difficult or too expensive to do the sort of the last carbon reduction in our energy services or in our energy use. And then we might have to do more in the non-energy parts of this, so that we should do much more work there. And actually, part of the reason I think is also that it's politically very difficult to talk about these natural carbon sinks. You get into different types of conflict points than you do on the energy sector, also politically. Both within Europe, for instance, it's difficult to have that discussion because you have so many different interests across the union. But it is necessary. And at least we should start counting it in terms of how much more does the forest grow every year. It does grow in Norway, as an example, a lot. And it binds more carbon every year. But we don't count it properly. We don't discuss it in the discussion.
Ma'am?
Hello. My question is, excuse me, I like your points about China and what they need to do in order to actually reduce the CO2. What are the chances they actually will ever do that? Because 67% reduction in their coal use, it's a little bit too much, I would say. I don't see China doing it. And the second question is, like, you were saying renewables in Europe will tie Spain to, like, lines to Germany. How this is feasible, given the fact that, in my opinion, European Union is going more each on their own versus a common policy? Thank you.
Thanks. No, very good and very difficult questions, I guess. And you might be right that it might turn out to be impossible to reduce coal demand in China by 67%. The good thing about coal reduction in China is that it addresses not only the carbon issue, but it addresses the local pollution issues as well. There's one reason to get coal out of the mix in China is that it also helps on the pollution side. To some extent, you could foresee technological developments where they clean up the coal without taking the carbon, and then it might be even more difficult to get the coal down. Then they solve their local pollution problems, but we're all in trouble because of the carbon emissions. If they don't, then we'll have to do something else. What else is more plausible to get to the 2-degree target? And that's we've illustrated some possibilities here to getting energy-related emissions down sufficiently globally. And one of the necessary things we think is 80% reduction in the OECD countries, it's 67% in China, and it's 20% in India. Gradual increase first and then a decline. And then, of course, changes elsewhere. If that turns out to be impossible, it's the same thing if it turns out to be impossible with the very radical energy efficiency improvement assumptions that we have. Then we need to do something else. We need and on the coal side, Shell doesn't, if you interpret the Shell Sky scenario in this way, they do not believe it's possible to get coal-fired electricity so much down. And as a consequence, they believe it's possible with 4 billion tons of carbon capture and storage. We have another way. We have 1.5 billion tons of carbon capture and storage because we don't need. So we, and did this disappear now? Yeah. Battery went out. That's another problem with electrification. But and I think our point is that we need a lot of different things here across the spectrum. As I said, there is no silver bullet, and it will only happen to the extent that we make economic policies drive these smart types of changes. On the EU side, what you're describing is the part of the EU development that is contained in the rivalry scenario. If EU continues to be an entity that quarrels about everything and some countries leave, and then we can forget the necessary energy and climate policy and necessary investments in the EU that is required in the renewal scenario. The renewal scenario assumes a global and regional political climate of cooperation, of trust, of understanding that the climate challenge is a huge collective challenge that can only be solved collectively. There's nothing we can do each and every one to solve that. And as a consequence, in that scenario, it's possible within the EU to get acceptance for the necessary infrastructure investments to make decarbonisation as efficiently as possible. If that is not the case, then we're not in a renewal scenario, we think. Then we're somewhere else. We're in a rivalry scenario that could be more renewable, has more renewables than we have here. You can draw up another rivalry scenario, but you cannot put that into our renewal scenario, because our renewal scenario assumes that the EU tags along well, you get the necessary changes in the coal-fired electricity in Poland, for instance, which is one key challenge, etc., etc.
Any additional questions? One more? Yeah, go ahead.
I forgot the extra one about electricity cars. Like, I see that will be the path, but how are you going to make them not depend on the 80% use of fossil fuel? Because that's the battery, and they still use electricity they use is based on fossil fuels. So how are you going to get away with that?
Well, you have to decarbonize the electricity sector, and which is an enormous challenge. And of course, electrifying the car fleet gives us much more efficient cars. So the overall energy use of a car is smaller when it's electric than when it's running on a combustion engine. So that helps a bit. But if you take into account the life cycle emissions associated with batteries, and if it runs on coal-fired electricity, then the delta on CO2 emissions is very small. So electrification of cars it's one element of a bigger package that is necessary, but that even more importantly contains decarbonization of electricity across the world, basically. And so it's not one without the other. And then if we can't do decarbonization of electricity sufficiently fast in the manner we have done it, we have to seriously talk about the possibility of using even more nuclear electricity. In the renewal scenario, we do have roughly twice as much nuclear electricity globally as today, and most of that is the growth in Asia and in the Middle East to make it possible to take out sufficient amounts of coal. And just replacing the obsolete nuclear facilities in the industrialized economy is going to be extremely challenging to keep the capacity from falling. But if carbon is the most serious problem, if we're in a world where we trust each other and thereby use the most efficient technology around the world, then small-scale nuclear or modern nuclear facilities might have to be part of the picture. The problem is, of course, that it's so expensive.
Please go ahead.
Just to dovetail on what you last said. Not only is it expensive, but it takes a long time, the planning, construction, licensing process. Can you address how that factor plays, the duration of just realizing installed nuclear capacity bears upon a lot of these analyses today?
Yeah, if we need a lot of new investments to change the electricity system, in general, it's a problem if permitting, licensing, building takes too long time, because then we will rely on the existing sources longer, whether that is coal or whatever. It is probably extremely relevant for nuclear in the western part of the world, that it takes a while. It goes faster in China at the moment. They build more nuclear facilities. But we also, unfortunately, have a parallel on that in one of the frustrating points about the necessary change, and for a company that also would like to invest in profitable renewables and new energy solutions, is that process is also extremely slow. There's not a large stream of investment opportunities in large-scale new renewable facilities all over the world that comes in and have the international oil companies and energy companies bid on them and build them quickly. Once we get past the approval stage and the competition, then it goes fast to build these plants, right? But if you so this goes. One of the reasons why it goes slow is basically that we're in the industrialized part of the world. We're replacing electricity, old electricity, with new electricity. We do not build sufficient amounts of new electricity plants in the countries of the world where electricity demand is going up. We should build much more renewable sources of electricity in India, as an example. But permitting is difficult. The framework conditions are difficult. You face a lot of above-ground country risk in those types of regimes. That slows down the ability of the international energy industry to make that bet and take the risk, right? So generally all these processes, and just imagine if you have in the United States have to build a lot of new trunk lines of electricity across state borders. Is that going to? It might be easier than gas pipelines, but it's still going to slow down the process, probably, right? So those types of issues have to be handled here, which is one of the challenges of making the change happen sufficiently quickly.
And sir, you'll be our last question.
Thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. Two questions. The first is some of your colleagues at the likes of Shell, their scenarios do feed sort of geopolitics into their perspectives. I'd be interested to hear how geopolitics figured into your perspectives going forward, particularly rivalry. And also if you could say something on, you alluded to energy subsidy reform in the Middle East, North Africa. There have been headwinds and there have been developments, particularly in the likes of Saudi Arabia, from Muscat to Rabat, actually. But if you could share your thoughts on where that's going, particularly Middle East and Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess in a sense, geopolitics is an important framework condition around not only the rivalry scenario, but also the renewal scenario in particular. And one of the reasons why those scenarios are so different is that the geopolitical situation we have assumed is extremely different. In the renewal scenario, it's a very benign world. It doesn't fit very well with sanctions on Russia or Iran. It doesn't fit very well with conflicts in the South China Sea. It doesn't fit well with tariffs and protectionism. And Brexit doesn't fit in the renewal at all, not to mention some other politicians. In the rivalry scenario, all those things are built in. And where we have we've become sufficiently brave to say that some of those concerns, priorities, legitimate political priorities, in addition to the carbon challenge, could affect development in other directions and thereby slow down things like economic growth, but also slow down the necessary energy transition. In rivalry, for instance, which I didn't talk about and which is hidden a bit in the report, but due to higher conflict levels in the Middle East and North Africa in that scenario than in some of the others, there will be larger problems delivering the necessary oil and gas supply in that scenario, which will lift the price. And when you look at the demand there, that means a bigger requirement for things like shale oil and shale gas out of North America to satisfy demand. So we have higher shale oil production in rivalry than we do in renewal. In the renewal scenario, which is, happy-go-lucky world, we're all going that direction, we allow OPEC to be a very large source of oil and gas, because for the world that is most efficient. It's the cheapest oil. To some extent, it's also the most energy efficient and low carbon type of oil and gas production, to some extent, not always. And it's also a source of revenue that makes it more likely that large resource holding countries in the Middle East will accept the change. So that's how that plays out. And you can write the rivalry scenario differently, with even more focus on energy supply, security of supply, drives even more renewable investments in some countries as well than we have. So that's another story. But we think you meet the limit there, as the moment you see that all these Asian countries have so much coal that they would like to use in that type of world. Right? So you had another question, but
Headwinds in the Middle East.
yeah, I mean, but that's part of it. That's one of the reasons why this is difficult. Fortunately, things are happening on the fossil fuel subsidy side. It did happen in Asia first, and it might go in that direction. And reducing use of oil in Middle East is also a way for the Middle Eastern countries to reduce their net exports of oil. So replacing domestic use, because domestic use of oil is enormous. So if you're worried about export revenues, and you can use the sun there to provide a lot of electricity, making that possible. And then gradually, one way of doing that is, of course, to take down the subsidies as well. And in the renewal scenario, it has to happen. But there are some economic arguments at least at the macroeconomic level in a country like Saudi Arabia to do it. Yes.
Well, I want to thank you again very much for joining us here in the room. As I mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms. This is just one of a number of great events that we're hosting in the coming weeks. Upcoming events include the future of petrochemicals, a presentation by Peter Levy, energy analyst at the IEA and co-lead author of the upcoming IEA report, titled the same, on October 17th at 6 p.m. The IEA's 2018 Renewable Energy Market Report, presented by Hemi Bahar, Renewable Energy Markets Analyst at the IEA and Project Manager for the report, on October 26th at 9:30 a.m. And Triple Access, Iran's Relations with Russia and China, a book launched by Dina Esfandiari and Ariane Tabatabai on November 14th at 6 p.m. We hope to see you again, and please join me again in thanking Eirik one last time. Thanks.